Good morning and welcome. Thank you so much for participating in our first panel discussion. This discussion is actually going to look at financial abuse, what it is, and how banks are currently responding to this particular community issue, and what ethical challenges we need to consider.
So I have been working in financial wellbeing for about 8 years, particularly focused on building financial capability. And I guess about 3 or 4 years ago, I started to get interested in what happens when you are financially capable but have no options to implement the kind of strategies one might want to improve their financial well-being. And seeing just how prevalent financial abuse was amongst people experiencing domestic and family violence, and how insidious that was, and how much it undermined the kinds of options that were available to people, I guess really got me both angry and interested. And so I've been spending more and more time focused on financial abuse. In terms of my background, before working for Domestic Violence Service Management, I was working for Commonwealth Bank in financial wellbeing programs, firstly for students, the schools program, and then developing a program for employees. And before working at the bank, I worked for Financial Literacy Australia. But at the bank, my interest in financial abuse ended up resulting in a guide to addressing financial abuse, which we partnered with Domestic Violence New South Wales to produce, and then producing a guide for women's financial wellbeing, which was designed to be sort of more of a preventative piece. But the work that I'm currently doing is really trying to understand more deeply from lived experience the kinds of tactics that perpetrators are using to perpetrate financial abuse, how women are navigating that abuse, how they're resisting and responding to that violence, understanding the context in which that violence takes place and the kinds of ways that influences decisions that victims and survivors may choose. And importantly, how are people and organisations, communities, services, how are they responding? And are those responses helpful or unhelpful or even harmful? And there's absolutely evidence that quite often responses can be really harmful. So my intent and the reason I'm happy to engage in forums like this is, how do we better support women's economic safety? How do we inform better responses from services and systems to people experiencing economic abuse?
So I'm Tracy McLeod-Howe, and I'm CEO of the Child Abuse Prevention Service. And previously I was the CEO of New South Wales Council of Social Service and Domestic Violence New South Wales. And so I've been very interested in any abuse at all of the community, I suppose, and vulnerable people. And I have worked with, I would say particularly the Commonwealth Bank, have pulled in Domestic Violence New South Wales when I was there to be part of the conversation. And I've been quite happy with the way they've tried to lay out a bit of an olive branch and say, what can we do better? So it's something that has interested me, and I've seen keep on peaking. It seems to be frank, getting worse rather than better, because there are new modes of abuse that are available. So that's my interest. My interest is in vulnerable communities being empowered, hearing their stories and being able to make change for themselves. And financial abuse, particularly of women, is something that is sort of at my heart and really bothers me viscerally. So that's why I'm here today.
Kathy, what brings you here today?
Okay, so the main reason that I'm really interested in participating in this conversation today is because of my own personal lived experience of family violence and financial abuse. So I've actually survived 2 long-term abusive relationships, one which was when I was 22 and was 3.5 years, followed by 10 years of stalking harassment. And then the second relationship lasted 6.5 years and ended in 2016. And the perpetrator of the second relationship, he walked out and left me $50,000 in debt with a joint loan. And the impact that has had on my life has been absolutely devastating. So it started quite a journey for me over the last few years of addressing what I need to do to actually overcome that for myself. But also in terms of professionally, my background's working at Centrelink and also in the superannuation sector. So I've definitely witnessed and responded to many circumstances where service users and members of the super funds have been going through family violence and financial abuse. So it has led actually to my current position where I'm now at Monash Health, which the role that I have there is the Family Violence Lived Experience Consultant in the Mental Health Family Violence Project team. And so I see the intersection of how the impacts of financial abuse on someone's mental health and well-being, and also their physical health and well-being, because that's had a huge impact for me throughout all of this, that the financial stress and tension has triggered my PTSD, depression and anxiety, and then that's actually triggered the muscular injuries that I have as a result of the attacks, and they flare up, and then I need time off as a result of that, which then further impacts the financial situation. And so I guess having now been a family violence survivor advocate with Safe Steps Family Violence Response Centre for the last 12 years, I've been really trying to look at what ways that people with lived experience, such as myself, can actually be part of changing the narrative and addressing the gaps in systems and services. And that, for me, I can see that increasingly organisations are wanting to engage people like myself to actually use our voices to create better responses to employees, to service users. And it was great, for example, with Rebecca to be invited to be involved in that Women's Financial Wellbeing Guide last year. So look, I think when it comes to these issues, nothing can happen in a silo. It is so interlinked, and we need to have a holistic response that crosses across the variety of sectors.
That's great, Kathy. Thank you so much for your courage and for letting us know about your lived experience. I might actually start with you then. From that lived experience perspective, what did or does financial abuse mean to you?
Well, in my individual situation, it has meant that it severely limited my options in my life. Like, I haven't had a holiday since 2012. That in itself has a huge impact on my well-being and my mental health. It's had times for me because at the point my perpetrator walked out, I discovered I was pregnant, and the stress of being left with this massive debt and also all the regular household expenses that suddenly just came to me to pay for all of that. It really caused so much stress that I actually miscarried the first child that I'd ever attempted to have. So I've lost a child. It led to me all this situation as well, not being able to at sometimes meet my basic needs. I'd have to be making a choice between, did I put food in the cupboard or did I pay the bills or the rent? And it's the thing too that it gets to a point where you feel like you're telling your story over and over again and you're not actually being heard. And that's initially how I've sort of really felt with the bank that I had the loan with. And there were times I'd have to say, and I would express this to the customer service employees at ME Bank, that the situation with this debt was leading me to a point of feeling suicidal. And I made it really clear that the stress of this had contributed to a miscarriage, and that it was actually something that made me need to go and work multiple jobs just to make ends meet. And I can't even imagine how much more stressful the last 3 years could have been than what it has. But what has been really great is that over the last 3 years, I've been continually having a conversation with ME, And I've had this year an amazing change of the way that they're now approaching my circumstance, and they've now made a commitment to how they will actually address all individuals, both employees and their customers, people who are customers there, to actually have policies that respond to family violence, financial abuse, and also other vulnerability factors, which is amazing.
That is amazing. Kathy, what do you think was their catalyst for them to do something to change?
The catalyst was that I just wouldn't let the issue go. That every single conversation that I had with them, I would be saying, you need to do more, you need to do better. The retail banks are actually doing better at the moment than this. And having worked, for example, in my last role at HESTA as the Business Development and Policy Coordinator, where I was very much involved in the Financial Inclusion Action Plan work that they're doing there, I got to be a part of seeing what was happening in the FIAP space and also the Thriving Community Partnership space. And I just thought, this is a no-brainer. Why are not all financial institutions actually being required to sign on to this type of network where you're actually sharing knowledge and resources for best practice, so people are getting referrals to the correct community service providers, that there is that no wrong door approach. And so whether it was calling the contact centre or whether it was at a conference or a work event or whatever it may be, if there was someone from the bank there, I would have the discussion and say, this is how this has impacted on me, this is how it's continuing to impact on me. Why do you not actually have a specific policy around family violence and financial abuse? It's not just generic hardship. You need to do more. And it got to a point 3 years into this discussion that one of the customer service team actually finally decided to escalate my case due to customer relations. And as a result of that, they did a full investigation of my circumstances, and they took on board the ABA's and the AFCA's definitions of financial abuse and applied that to my case. Initially, I have to say they made an offer and wanted me to sign a non-disclosure agreement, and I rejected that and said, that's not appropriate. I'm an advocate in this space and wish to effect social change and improvement around these issues, and I will tell my story when and where I want to. So we went back to the drawing board, and they came back with a much more respectful offer to me, which allowed me to actually be able to discuss this, and for them to actually be on a learning journey as well and recognise that financial abuse and family violence needs a specific response and that they need to commit to training their staff around this issue.
Thank you, Kathy. What courage, and it just shows the power of that lived experience and sharing that narrative, and how important it is to keep sharing that narrative. Unfortunately, even though it means telling the story over and over again, you're showing that by doing that, you are making impact and change. Rebecca, I'd like to ask you, I'm sure that you've probably heard Kathy's story a few times in your work. From your perspective, what is financial abuse and how do we recognise it?
I really just want to say how much thank you, Kathy, for the raw reality of what financial abuse means, because that, I think, is what has inspired me. I draw strength from Kathy and from women like Kathy. But to give a more sort of dry definitional kind of idea of financial abuse, it's really a form of family violence where one person tries to limit another person's ability to acquire, use or maintain economic resources. And that undermines their financial independence and it undermines their economic safety. We do talk about 3 different sort of loose categories of financial abuse. So there's financial control, where someone is either limiting access to cash or bank accounts, certainly limiting any input into financial decision making. There's financial exploitation, which Kathy was really a victim of in a really significant way, where her partner was responsible for a large part of that debt that was built up in her name, and then he left, leaving her with the whole amount. And then the third sort of major category of financial abuse, if you like, is financial sabotage, which is where someone may sabotage someone's ability to get to work or get to study or take up study and employment opportunities. And that's really common as well, and has an enduring impact, because someone may not work for many years. That means they don't have super for many years. It may mean getting back into the workforce is really difficult because of a long time out of it, perhaps an issue of confidence, perhaps an issue of skills needing to be sort of enhanced and brought up to date. So financial abuse, you asked how long lasting it is. As Kathy has just attested, it's really long lasting. And the longer you experience it for, the likelihood is the longer those impacts are going to be a part of your life.
Rebecca, is there any research around the data here that gives us an idea of the prevalence of domestic violence and financial abuse?
Yeah, there was a major study done by Dr. Josica Cuton and Rosalind Russell out of RMIT, which showed that 1 in 6 women and I think it was 1 in 14 men are likely to experience economic abuse in their lifetime. They will acknowledge that's a really conservative estimate. It's based on the ABS Personal Security Survey, which has just 5 tactics of financial abuse, and asks people if they've experienced any of those 5. I'm keeping a running tally. There is no finite list of tactics that someone can employ, but even if you were to group them together and kind of recognise things that you see time and time again, I mean, I've got a list of 30 or 40 that I'm seeing repeatedly in the conversations I'm having with people. And a lot of the study that's been done about what are the tactics of financial abuse that are common, technology is moving so fast that was kind of a point in time piece of research, and the way perpetrators are using technology to continue to undermine someone's economic safety is really significant, and is not captured in some of that initial academic research. So conservatively 1 in 6 women, but I would say we're looking at a much bigger figure than that.
Thank you, Rebecca. Actually, you made a really interesting comment about tactics. Could you actually talk a bit more to that, and particularly around technology and how that's impacting this whole arena of domestic violence and financial abuse?
So one of the great things about banking, being easier to access on your phone and online and so on, it makes it easier for us to do our banking on the go, on the train or whatever. But it also means it's much easier for people to do to open accounts in someone else's name by using, all online opening. No one ever actually has to front up to a branch anymore and be identified. And so it's very easy for perpetrators to have access to enough identifying material to set up accounts in someone else's name without their knowledge, set up credit cards in someone else's name without their knowledge. So that's exploiting someone financially, potentially taking out debts in their name. But there's also the control. So it used to be that you would be given, a small amount of cash and have to account for every penny. But now a perpetrator can monitor in real time with these, real-time alerts of a credit card being used or a bank account being used. And so it's not just that a perpetrator might be monitoring where have you spent this money, and there might be consequences, and, you might have hell to pay if you've spent outside of the agreed terms. But there's also real-time physical safety risks in that it may be a relationship they're trying to leave, and a perpetrator may know, all right, they've just spent money, I've got a real-time alert, they've just spent money at Westfields, in this suburb, and so their physical safety can be at risk as well. That's just a small, it's extraordinary the number of tactics and the creativity around those tactics. Usually I use the word creativity as a positive, but it's really disturbing.
So what can the financial institutions do to make a difference in this area? What do you think?
Well, getting aware, and I think that they're doing that. So they're more and more trying to test their new products with a gender lens, with a financial abuse lens. And I am talking about the big four in particular. But there is a lot more to be done. There is I guess, about consistency. And also these institutions are so big, you have little silos of good work. But then there might be a product team over there that's never spoken to the domestic and family violence working group or the security team. So, those silos are really a bit of a barrier to sort of best practice responses to financial abuse.
I'm going to Kathy, to ask you, Kathy, from what Rebecca's just shared with us, if you're comfortable, what sort of financial abuse did you experience?
I'll go into that in just a moment, but I just wanted to touch on what you just asked Rebecca, and that was that financial institutions, first and foremost, have to acknowledge this as an issue. Because when I first switched from working at Centrelink to superannuation at the first fund that I was at, I remember very clearly in training putting to the trainer, what happens if we are contacted by someone who's going through family violence and financial abuse? And the trainer said to me, oh no, that doesn't happen here. And in my mind, I went, bullshit. But in terms of, at that point, I was like, you know what, I'll just stay quiet. I'll go and gather some empirical evidence and I'll come back and present that to the managers, which, not surprisingly, it didn't take me too long to be able to do that. But it's also having a whole of organisation response, which is where the financial inclusion action plan type of process is really valuable, because it's being led from the top down and actually acknowledging that every part of your workforce has a responsibility to this issue. So when I now go back to my personal experience, well, being in a situation where you experience family violence or financial abuse does not discriminate. I want to make it really clear that when I was going through the second relationship, I was actually, throughout that entire relationship, a family violence advocate for Safe Steps. I knew the warning signs and I still found myself with a perpetrator again. I was working within the finance sector. I'd worked at Centrelink and I still found myself subject to coercive control. So how that played out in our dynamic that I experienced was mostly because of his addictions to gambling, online shopping, drinking, and demanding a certain type of lifestyle that if he didn't have that all sorts of threats would occur. And because he was someone that came from a different country, at the beginning of our relationship, it actually suited him that he couldn't get contracts for things because he wasn't a permanent resident yet. But later, after he'd become a permanent resident, he didn't really feel the need to change anything to be in his name, because it made it really quite simple for him to be able to walk out from these things, which is what he eventually did. But what I guess came as a massive shock to me was to find that there was practically zero protections for someone in my situation, and which I'm sure I'm just the tip of a massive iceberg of people who've gone through a similar situation, to find that you can sign a joint legal document, yet one person can walk away from that with absolutely zero responsibility. And I remember when I reached out to Emmy when the relationship first broke down, to say, look, I'm going through this crisis. I need help. What do you suggest? How are you going to hold him accountable for his share of this? And I was told, well, you could declare bankruptcy. And I said, well, actually, no, I'm working at a superannuation fund and I cannot be a declared bankrupt. That would mean I can't work in that sector. They said, oh, well, you can default on your payments and then we'll go after him. And I said, well, actually, no, because then that'll affect my credit rating. And yet again, I'm the one who then ends up in a worse situation. I got served with a legal letter from a community legal centre where he actually decided that he wanted to go after my superannuation. So that I received a letter that was an entire fishing expedition for all my financial affairs. And the way it was worded, and if I wasn't a bit sort of savvy around this, it was really like, you know, reply to this within 7 days with all these documents. But it wasn't actually a court order, so I had no need to respond to that. But if I hadn't have gone, hang on a second, I need legal advice right now, if I hadn't had any sort of time that I've worked in this sort of area, I would have probably felt really intimidated into providing all those documents. And as it stood, I did get legal advice from a different community legal centre, because being a working person, you don't qualify for legal aid, and I couldn't afford to pay a private lawyer. So the advice I got at the time was, you can actually wait for 2 years post the family law period and go after him under civil law. But if you were to pursue him right now under family law, because we had been together for 6.5 years, he actually will come out of this better, because despite the debt, the amount of superannuation that I had from the period of time I'd worked throughout that relationship, it still would have meant he would have got a split of my super in his favour. So that really all advice I got was of no benefit or help to me at all.
I'm so sorry to hear that, Kathy. Kathy, what would you have preferred, or how would you have been supported better by the financial institutions if they had been more aware? What would help you? What would have helped you?
Well, I think initially what would have really helped is to acknowledge that this is a special dynamic which requires a specific response. And if you're looking at hardship provisions, that you need to be more flexible, and you need to equip your staff with the knowledge how to be sensitive around responding to these issues. Ideally, I think what really has to change, though, is the way that contracts are written up in the beginning, so that each party who signs a contract such as a joint loan or a credit card and any of these unsecured debts, that they actually have to, and this will feed into all the stuff that's come from the Royal Commission into the banking and finance sector about financial institutions taking a bit more responsibility and duty of care, to go, right, in the contract, we're going to actually state that you need to agree to what amount that you're happy to have split if your relationship be that romantic, business or family, should that relationship break down. And in the discussion at that point before the loan or credit card is even granted, if people who are applying for that can't even agree, then that gives financial institutions the opportunity to actually suggest maybe you'd like to get some legal advice or to speak to a financial counsellor before you proceed. And it also gives them the opportunity to see any red flags and pick up if there's a referral needed to somewhere like 1800 Respect or another type of support services.
Thank you, Kathy. I'd like to now welcome Tracy McLeod-Hoey, the CEO of Child Abuse Protection. Hello, Tracy.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Tracy, we've been talking about financial abuse and what it means and how the banking and financial sector is currently responding. From your perspective, do you see the impact from this particular life challenge in your particular work?
Yeah, I mean, my background too, before child abuse prevention, was in women's refuges, and I used to be the CEO of Domestic Violence New South Wales. And so very much financial abuse was something that came on my radar quite quickly, because the poverty that impacts women is the thing that means that can't actually leave. And then when we go to the work that's happening these days and with the Banking Royal Commission, I think that this message is actually getting through at last. We know you may have already discussed the fact that we've got the there's policies and guidelines that come from the ABA, or the Australian Bankers Association, to try and support and have a ballast to the banks and financial institutions about what they should keep an eye out for in relation to domestic violence overall, but in particular in their industry, it's around use of financial abuse. And then we've got the Code of Practice that kicked in on the 1st of July. My issue is, to go back to what was being said previously, is that we have these codes of practice, we have policies. It's the actual implementation of those, and that they're actually framed around real life case studies and stories about how that works in the real world, because it looks great if you go on Google and you say, oh, the banks are doing all this amazing stuff and they've signed on to do this. And it's good because they've made the commitment on paper, but that has to trickle down and actually have meaning and value, because they're working from a perspective of those real stories that we hear. So for me, it's the trickle down to those people like the brokers, for example. There's a whole raft of people who have a capacity not to know that you are under financial duress or financial abuse is happening for you, and they need to be trained. So the arterial reach of where the power happens for women to be, I'd say women mostly, disempowered by financial abuse or financial abuse with elders, goes right through not just to the bank, but to those third parties that they also contract. And the training required is huge. So just implementing something from 1 July doesn't mean we're going to see good things happen. It doesn't mean it's going to get to the nuance of when these things can impact people, because they need to gather the real stories. And for me, as someone who's worked as an advocate for, 15, 20 years now, I know that those banking institutions are very, very much at the infancy of their journey of understanding this. So we've got these fabulous policies, we've got the code of practice, tick, tick. Now it's the doing, and it's people like us actually that need to be in there showing them how to do. As I say, I'm child abuse. We have guidelines now that have come through from our own Royal Commission about institutional sexual abuse. And then we have practices and policies that people are going to sign up to, but the doing is the hard bit. So I would say watch this space is important, but that people like Kathy Maloko and those on the panel, we sort of hold them to account, and we start to say, we need to be in your face telling you how you have to make this change. Case studies is everything. Real lived experience, I don't have it. I've been an advocate on behalf of, but the voices of those women and elders particularly is the growing area too, to be there and show the banks how to implement their very slick code of practice.
Tracy, thank you for that response. Can I ask you, and I'm going to go back and ask all the panellists this question about, well, let's go back to basics and how can we help a victim recognise if they're being financially abused?
One of the things you can do is first, and it goes for any type of abuse at all, is that you believe them in the first instance. And that one interaction when you believe that you can actually suggest to someone maybe this is a form of abuse is so key. It's like a little diamond that you have in that moment. So it's believing them, not judging them, and also being quite delicate around it, but suggesting that they have an opportunity, if they want to make a plan. And being across how a plan might look for a person is really important too, because there's a variety of things they can do. They can start to document their situation. So encourage them to actually write down what is happening for them in a safe way, or supporting them to do it. Talk to them about opportunities, like, is there a way you can channel a little bit of money away in an emergency fund? Is there someone that you know aside from me that you can get support from? Or can I help you go to Centrelink and ask what your options are? Or talk to your bank. It's starting to crack open those different people that you discuss this with. It's like any dirty secret. The more people who start to know it, the more power you have, because financial abuse at its very core is 100 things, but it's one thing. It's around a demonstration of the power and control of one person over another. And the more people you let into the secret, the less power they have, and the more opportunity you have to figure out the variety of ways that you can have a plan to help yourself. If you are the person who has that opportunity to be that bridge to a person, then give them all the options that you know. And even if it is to tell their employer, you may be the employer, then you sit down with them, believe them, say these are your options, give them the space, because all of the solutions is in that woman's self. She has the agency that you have to let free, and it's about finding out the variety of channels and ways and referral pathways and people they should connect to in order to break this dirty secret and take the power away from the abuser. And also, one thing that's very practical is try to figure out a way, if you haven't to date, of getting some credit in your own name, because oh my God, the level of power that you don't have, or disempowerment you have by not having any credit in your own name, for a lot of women that we would see in the refuge who've come on spousal visas or whatever, and they're not on anything, that they don't exist in the world, sadly. So I would say that is one of the things, is look at your credit, if that's one practical thing. The other things I was talking about, it's more around opening the discussion, cracking a light open on it, knowing that to create a plan takes 100 people. It takes a village to do anything, and it takes a village to get behind a woman, and we're all there ready and waiting. And if you're the one person, be open to sitting there with a pen and paper and write a plan with them and believe them.
Thank you, Tracy. Rebecca, I might come back to you and ask you, first of all, what you think are the signs or ways that we can help people to recognise if they're in this situation.
Yeah, Tracy's covered a lot of great things. I think it's really important that we increasingly name it. So talking with a lot of women who perhaps at the time they were experiencing financial abuse tell me that they didn't have a name for it, but that doesn't mean they didn't know something wrong. Something was wrong. They're feeling uncomfortable about decisions that are being made, about their access or lack of access to funds, or the kinds of debt that they're building up, supposedly jointly with this partner. So I think we're increasingly have to name it, because it's saying then it's not a secret anymore, is it? We're able to name it. But sitting and listening to someone and finding out by getting really close to what is happening, what is the dynamic, what is the context, what are going to be the things that will inhibit them from making certain decisions, potentially because they make them unsafe, and really listen to that. I think that it's important to be guided by a person's understanding of their own context. And I think the other important thing which Tracy touched on was credit reporting, and I guess this is sort of the converse, is often a lot of women don't have any financial products, they don't have a credit report, but on the flip side there'll be people who have been exploited by their partner, and it's only when they get a credit report that they can see that they actually have a whole range of products in their name, debts in their name, potentially defaults in their name, which they weren't aware of. So the credit report is, you can get one for free. You might have to wait up to 10 days to actually get it. You can pay money to get it quicker. But everyone has a right to that once a year. And it's really important, if you think something's not right in terms of the finances in your relationship, it's a really good place to start to understand.
Thank you, Rebecca. Rebecca, I'm sensing, and I can feel my own anxiety increasing listening to all of this, and having my own lived experience of domestic violence. I know that there is an impact to our mental health and well-being, and it was Kathy that really highlighted where she got to in a dark place and was suicidal. Is this something that you're seeing a lot of? That
Absolutely.
Mental health and physical health.
Without exception. And my passion for financial well-being came from a place before I had any understanding of financial abuse. My passion for financial well-being came from the understanding that it affects every other domain of well-being.
Yeah.
And you throw financial abuse into the mix. I mean, you cannot be physically well if you can't afford the medications that you need. You can't afford to see a doctor. You can't look after your mental health if you can't have a holiday for 10 years, or you can't afford to see a psychologist. You can't have the social connections that's so vital to our well-being if actually your partner decides when you can have money and actually your friends only want to meet in a cafe. You don't have the heart to tell them that you can't afford a coffee. So that total interconnectedness with every other part of well-being means, yes, if you're being sexually abused, then your physical, mental, your participatory, your social connections, they're all under threat and being undermined by that abuse.
Are you seeing any data to give you an idea of if there's a correlation between suicide and domestic violence financial abuse?
The closest I've seen has been Lifeline data, which the most common, this was a couple of years ago now, but the most common stress people talked about when calling Lifeline was financial stress. Now, I don't know behind that there's obviously a percentage that's going to be people experiencing financial abuse, but financial stress takes its toll on people in a really significant way.
And unfortunately, then you've got the cycle of if you can't afford that support and care, and a system that may not be able to help support that care as well, how can we help that vulnerable person as a society?
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I'm just wanting to go back to Tracy and ask you, Tracy, with the lived experience, telling their stories, that's something that you've been talking about in your introduction. How else can we use the power of the lived experience in trying to change banks and their financial services and their behaviours?
I suppose it's being at every stage of the development of their thinking. So it shouldn't have taken a Royal Commission, for example, for them to be good. And I guess in their defence, I don't want to be thought of defending banks in any way, but I know that there has been some work that's occurred over previous years with the banks trying to get their head around just domestic violence overall and the impact on them. So I would say that what we need to be doing is being involved with the banks at every step of the way. So that is at the development of the products, and this is the lived experience voice, at the development of the product, the rollout of the product and the testing, and also to have some kind of ongoing monitoring of this. So they should actually have advocates, I would say, advocates who are with lived experience, who inform all of the bank products, not just what is it that you do when someone is experiencing domestic violence or financial abuse. They should have this through any development of anything new. So it's not just saying that we want to have these, oh, here's a special credit card that's got, or debit card's got $500, that'll help you, or here we've got someone we can flick you through to 1-800-RESPECT. No, it should be in the development of any of your products. You should be thinking about your most vulnerable clients. And the Banking Code of Practice says this, that they should be thinking of the most vulnerable customers. But the only way to do that is that every step of the way, you have the vulnerable customer at the forefront. And also they should be, I would say, gathering the stories and keeping a library of what they don't actually know, because you don't know what you don't know until you see the worst of an abuser's canny capacity to figure out how to wield abuse and power and control in a financial way. So it's an ongoing conversation, have them there every step of the way, and also keeping them at the forefront when they create any new product. You should never create a new product, a new approach, a new app, whatever it is they're doing, without going, what is the impact likely to be on our most vulnerable customers? And we know that one of the things that shapes what is our most vulnerable customer is that financial abuse is something they're experiencing. So that's kind of it. I think basically they're everywhere in the journey.
Thank you, Tracy. I'd like to go back to Kathy. Kathy, you mentioned some really important points about what you were experiencing from a mental health perspective. What would have helped you at that time when you were experiencing this severe stress that I can only but imagine with all of these things going on? What were you experiencing? What were you feeling?
Well, the situation that I've found myself in over the last 3 years, which has come to known as the period of the tsunami of shit, that really, it's all well and good to have staff respond in a compassionate way, but if they're being compassionate but not actually taking any action that's appropriate or providing any referrals, it's sort of an empty response. So that's why it's so important to name the issue and also have corresponding policies around it. And that's, I completely agree about the need for co-design. don't presume what the needs of people with lived experience is. It's that whole community sector motto of nothing about us without us. It's also making sure that any organisation that wishes to really embark on a journey of change, is that they get consultation with the sort of organisations who have expertise in this area, like Wire. So, for example, after countless conversations with the bank about how much this was causing distress and harm in my life, and just coming up after closed door, it actually was when I was speaking to Wire's CEO, Julie Kuhn, that I got the first sort of chink of lighting that started opening up a bit of hope for me, and that was when she referred me on to Donna Letchford at Women's Legal Service here in Victoria. And it really highlighted to me the importance of people who've got that family violence awareness and training, so that they have that sensitivity of responding. It's not just like a one-size-fits-all approach. We have to look at this as a one-size-fits-one.
So, Kathy, what was that ray of hope that helped you to become an advocate and someone that's very comfortable in sharing your lived experience in a multitude of ways?
Well, to become an advocate around family violence for me, originally back in 2007, that was because I'd been continually failed by systems and services such as by the police, health services, the court system and so forth. And I was just really at my wit's end. But jumping forward to, it would have been 2017 when I was having this conversation with Donna, and having already experienced the power of how using my lived experience to affect change through the Royal Commission into Family Violence. And when she highlighted to me that there was actually already precedent with AFCA and ABA about the potential of splitting of loans, and how in situations of financial abuse, how circumstances like mine could be treated, I'm like, well, it's not good enough that I'm not being offered this at my bank. It should not actually be a lottery that because I've chosen financial institution A, I get this level of assistance, or if I go to financial institution B, I won't. It should be a basic industry standard that all organisations who are in the finance sector have to adhere to at least a minimum set of standards, and not be a tokenistic thing. They actually have to train their staff, they have to have policies, and as far as I'm concerned, it's one of these things that everything from the beginning, if you're starting on that, is make sure you have someone with lived experience involved in the code of mine.
Thank you, Kathy. One last question I'd like to ask all our panellists is, what more can we do in this space? Clearly there's so much, but what would be the short term, the first things that we should be addressing in this arena? Rebecca?
There are so many things I'll just talk about too that I think we've kind of alluded to in this conversation. The first is the problem of the joint and severally liable debts, and he's talked about it a lot. It's not good enough, and there must be a solution that banks can get comfortable with that enables, at a point of separation or where abuse becomes apparent, that a debt or loan can be split by whatever sort of pre-agreed amount to the two parties involved. Too often, the entire debt is left in the lap of one person, usually the woman. We've just seen it so often. I cannot accept that, it's difficult because the law says this. Well, the law needs to be changed. And I think that's within the realm of possibility if people just put their minds to saying it's important. I would say that's something that's got to happen. And the second thing was just touching on the point about co-design, and unfortunately, a lot of the existing financial institution response to financial abuse relies on someone disclosing that financial abuse is happening. There may be all sorts of really, really prudent reasons why someone doesn't do that or doesn't want to do that. And so I would say that while banks and so on are improving their responses to people who do disclose, they've kind of washed their hands of people who may be experiencing vulnerability for that range of other reasons who don't disclose that. And so this principle, community legal centres talked about it, this idea of universal design. So designing every product and process with people with lived experience in the room, with people with disabilities in the room, and testing how does this work in this context, in this context, in this context, just getting better at doing the basics rather than always thinking we've got to design a specific product and it will work in this way if someone discloses. Again, I don't think it's good enough. So I would say those two things. One is addressing the law around joint and severally liable and implementing more universal design principles in the design of financial products and services.
Thank you, Rebecca. Just one more question. What about the community's role in all of this? What can we do to help?
I guess demand better of the banks, ask questions of the banks about their, the products and services that are available. We all have a role to play, even if it's just to ask the question, and that might be enough.
Thank you, Rebecca. Tracy, I'd like to ask you the same questions. What do you think we need to do in the short term?
Well, now that we have a banking code of practice, we know that the banks have basically got on their websites, this is what we are, the standard we're held to, then I think there should be a corresponding obligation with every person who works in the bank that as soon as you relate to someone or you have a customer who you know or they have disclosed financial abuse of some kind with you, that you in fact own that until you know where it has gone to for a solution. Because I think all too often, the old saying, falling through the gaps, I think it's going to be really easy for us to look at the banks as signing on to this code of practice, having their policies and procedures around financial abuse, and knowing that someone picked up the phone and said, well, here's a phone number I can send you to. There should be a sense of ownership of that. What is the resolution of that? And you hold on to that customer until you know they have gone somewhere for support. Because to go to suicide, homelessness, kids falling out of school, people losing their jobs, whatever it is that the knock-on effect has been because you've just done a slam dunk job is not good enough. I think that it's incumbent on the banks who, let's face it, it's in their benefit to make sure that these things don't happen to customers. There's a financial payoff for them too, if they just want to look at the bottom line, that they own that relationship until it's resolved. Almost take on a case management role and not say this is not the bank's issue. It damn well is, because there is a link between a life event that flows on from you not taking hold and carriage of that issue that will impact your relationship with them as a customer. So that's it. Taking ownership, meaningful ownership, I would say in a case management kind of way. That might not be the word that they would use, but you get the sense of what I'm saying. Bloom and own it, don't just slam dunk it off to someone else. You've got enough money. Banks have enough money to put intensive resources and support around that. And the second piece that I would say, if we're going to two concepts, because we could talk all day, couldn't we, Rebecca? I've got a list, but if we're talking in twos, another thing would be just to really train staff, not about referral pathways and products and these are the solutions we can give to you, but start to have them really understand the narrative and the stories behind what's happening for people. Because I think the way that we connected with domestic violence in community was things like Rosie Batty happened, poor Luke happened, and everyone was elevated in their commitment to it being a community solution. So if you want your staff to become engaged with this in a meaningful way from their heart so that it becomes a cultural shift, then you have to let them know what are the stories and the narratives and the things that connects to them about where financial abuse is acted out in our communities. That would be my second thing.
Thank you.
I can give you 10 more, but I won't.
Thank you, Tracy. I'd like to have the last word with Kathy, who is our lived experience advocate. Kathy, I'd like to ask you for your two short-term recommendations that we could actually try and encourage the banks to take on to start moving into doing this more genuinely.
two things that I think are the easiest and quickest for them to do is have a policy and train your staff. So you're not going to be able to have an effective response if you're not actually recognising that there is an issue. And also too, just being mindful of what I've gone through this year with ME is really looking at how you word your documents. When I got their first offer after they reviewed my situation, it was a highly victim blaming document. It triggered my PTSD and anxiety to a level that I actually couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, I was vomiting, and I had to call Lifeline multiple times because of the way that document was worded. When I then escalated that after seeking some advice from people such as Kathy, then the person who I spoke to, the customer relations manager, who was amazing, and a woman called Teresa Tennant, she really took on board the impact that the wording had had on me and said, look, let's take this back to the drawing board and revisit this, and which they did. And they actually acknowledged in the second letter that the first letter had been inappropriately worded, and also took on board all the things that I discussed with them and really showed me that they were committed to this journey of improvement. So I'm actually, it's taken us a bit to get there, but I'm really happy with the journey we've gone on together there.
What about community support? What can the community do to help victims of financial abuse and domestic violence?
So in terms of community, yet again, it's about really breaking down the siloed approach. And if your organisation does X thing and you've limited the amount of things that you can do to assist the person, but you know that there's another service out there that can help someone, refer them. What I've seen over and over again for the different organisations I've worked across different sectors is that people forget that they're in such powerful situations to be gatekeepers of such important information. And even though it might sometimes sit outside of our normal daily role, if you have that knowledge as a professional, you have a responsibility to provide that to someone. It isn't up to the service user to know what exists out there for them. If they are saying, I'm going through X, Y, and Z situations, and you know something, tell them that.
Thank you, Kathy. I have to say this has been a most amazing discussion. I really appreciate your honesty and your courage for sharing your lived experience. And I'd also like to thank Rebecca and Tracy for their time as well. Thank you so much for participating. It's been great talking to you about.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.